Welcome back to English Podcast Go. I'm Cyrus, and each episode brings you closer to confident English. Let's jump into today's episode.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into something pretty universal, I think. Something that affects most of us, probably daily, whether we realize it or not.
That inner voice.
Exactly, that voice inside our heads that's just, well, often not very nice. Your inner critic.
The one that whispers or, sometimes screams that you're falling short somehow.
It's incredibly powerful, isn't it? This internal voice.
Totally.
And it feels like such a private struggle, but as we'll explore today, it actually has these huge implications for how we, move through the world.
Absolutely. How we interact with everyone around us.
And our journey into this today is guided by a really fascinating source.
Yeah, it's the transcript of a TED Talk. The speaker, he's a former newsman. Pretty skeptical guy, actually.
Right, and he went on this wild personal adventure after getting some incredibly harsh feedback about himself.
Brutal stuff. And he walks us through confronting these difficult parts of himself and then discovering this surprisingly powerful, almost counterintuitive idea.
Which is?
Being kind to himself.
Self-kindness. Seems simple, but it's not always easy.
Not at all. And he connects that really personal shift to how it impacted his relationships and even, he argues, the wider world.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. Unpack the key insights from his experience as he shared it in this source.
We'll dig into the specific examples he uses, the stories.
And pull out the practical ideas he offers for anyone looking to maybe quiet that inner critic a bit.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the story in our source, it really kicks off when the speaker decides to get a 360 review.
Right. And for anyone maybe not familiar, that's usually a corporate tool, right? You get feedback from your bosses, your peers.
People who report to you. Gives you that rounded picture.
But he didn't just do the standard version. Oh, no.
He calls it the colonoscopy version.
Agrees. Yeah, great description. He didn't just ask colleagues. He included his wife, his brother.
Even his meditation teachers.
Yeah. 16 people gave these confidential hour-long interviews.
Which resulted in this massive 39-page report, just packed with anonymous feedback.
Wow. That sounds intense.
Right. And he explains why he did it. He'd been meditating for several years, and he really wanted to see, was all that inner work actually showing up on the outside?
Was he actually becoming a better person, nicer colleague, more present husband?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
He was basically testing his own hypothesis with brutal honesty required.
Yeah. And the feedback initially was just quite positive.
It was. He says the first 13 pages were all about his sterling qualities.
Okay.
People called him hardworking, intelligent, and a lot of them specifically noted that meditation seemed to have made him more caring.
So far, so good. Feels pretty validating.
For about 13 pages.
Okay. But then...
New twist.
Then came what he calls the remaining 26 pages.
Yeah.
The beatdown.
Whew. Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. And painful, I imagine.
Definitely. The criticisms were specific. They came with examples.
Reviewers pointed out things like a penchant for being rude to junior staffers. He was described as emotionally guarded.
A diva.
And an authoritarian. Ouch.
Yeah, those are tough words. Some feedback even questioned his motives, like his sincerity in promoting meditation.
Wow. Just hearing those. Diva, authoritarian. He talks about the personal impact of seeing this laid bare, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. The deep embarrassment, the pain.
Yeah.
Seeing the parts he was most ashamed of, his anger, his self-centeredness.
It's right there on full display.
Yeah, a direct confrontation with his blind spots.
Yes.
Or maybe the parts he tried to hide even from himself.
And this really personal struggle leads him to a broader observation in the source material.
Right. He notes that despite years of inner work, meditating and all that, he clearly still had the capacity to be, a schmuck, as he puts it.
Agrees.
And he connects this individual thing, his own capacity for difficult behavior, to what he sees happening more broadly in society.
Like rising incivility, online negativity.
Exactly. A sense that things are kind of unraveling because people are just stuck in their own heads, maybe being hard on themselves and then taking it out on others.
So after this incredibly challenging feedback, he didn't just, give up.
No, he decided he needed to double down on the self-improvement.
Not just for himself, but with this really ambitious goal. He wanted to learn something that could, quote, help the species.
Which is quite a leap from personal feedback to helping the species.
It is. And he threw everything at it. Psychotherapy,
communications coaching, bias training, couples counseling. He lists them off.
And he's clear. He says all of these were valuable. They helped.
No.
But he still found himself falling back into those old patterns sometimes, being selfish or snippy too often, as he says.
Which kind of set the stage for the next big turning point in his story.
Yeah. Which was?
A 9-day silent retreat, specifically focused on a practice called loving-kindness meditation.
Ah, okay. And he admits his initial reaction wasn't exactly enthusiastic?
Not at all. He said it sounded like, quote, Valentine's Day with a gun to my head.
Relates. That skeptical journalist really comes through there.
Totally. But he went. And his teacher at the retreat, Spring Washam, she kept coming back to this one instruction.
An instruction he really resisted.
Yeah, big time. She said, if you want to be less of a jerk to others, you have to start by being less of a jerk to yourself.
Okay. Seems profound, but I can see the resistance.
He admits he initially mentally lumped this advice in with things he'd hear from, quote, Instagram influencers and spin instructors.
Understand, like it sounded too soft, too fluffy.
Exactly. Just not serious enough, maybe.
And then the teacher gave him this really specific instruction for when those difficult parts of himself flared up during meditation.
Right. Put your hand on your heart and say, it's okay, sweetie, I'm here for you.
And his immediate internal reaction.
Hard pass. Pasadena.
Relates. That is such a relatable reaction. We really resist being that gentle with ourselves, don't we?
We do. But as he describes it, during those days of nonstop meditation, those twin demons, he talks about anger and self-centeredness, they were absolutely in full effect.
He gives some vivid examples, doesn't he, what was going through his head?
Oh, yeah. Rehearsing these angry, expletive-filled speeches to his boss in his mind.
Or writing glowing, fake 5-star Amazon reviews for his own books.
Praising his elegant prose and rugged good looks.
Acknowledges, okay, yes, the internal monologues we maybe don't admit to having out loud.
Exactly. And his immediate default reaction to seeing all that stuff churning inside.
Let me guess. Not self-kindness.
Definitely not. He calls it an avalanche of self-criticism, telling himself the story that he was just an incurably self-obsessed, cranky monster.
That's the classic pattern, isn't it? The toilet vortex starting point.
Totally. You see something difficult about yourself and immediately just pile on the shame and judgment. It's the opposite of, it's okay, sweetie.
The exact opposite.
But after about 5 or 6 days of this relentless cycle, something shifted. He just caved. Mid-meditation, he put his hand on his heart.
Did he say sweetie?
Still couldn't bring himself to say sweetie, but he did say, quote, it's all good, dude. I know this sucks, but I've got you.
Huh. That subtle shift in internal language, even just dude.
That was the epiphany. He realized in that moment that these things, these demons, they weren't inherent broken parts of his identity that needed to be crushed or eliminated.
What were they then?
He started seeing them as ancient fear-based neurotic programs. Maybe from his culture, maybe his parents.
And in a strange sort of misguided way, they were actually trying to help him or protect him.
Exactly. They were strategies his system developed to cope, maybe when he was younger, even if they were ultimately maladaptive now.
So the key wasn't to fight these parts of himself.
No. It was to meet them with acceptance. And warmth, even.
He landed on that great analogy, didn't he? Instead of fighting the demons.
You should give them a high five.
Yes. And he's careful to clarify what that doesn't mean, right?
Super important clarification. It's not about indulging the negative behavior itself.
Yeah.
You're not saying, oh yeah, go ahead and be rude.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the underlying fear or insecurity that's driving the behavior. Acknowledging that with kindness.
He calls it, quote, radical disarmament.
Yeah. You're disarming the fear, not giving a pass to the resulting action. It's subtle but crucial.
And this realization led him to visualize these two distinct paths we can take. He illustrates them with drawings in the source.
The idea of 2 different spirals that are available to us.
The first one he calls
the toilet vortex.
Agrees. Right. And it starts, as you mentioned earlier, with self-criticism.
Yeah. You pick yourself apart for how you look or how much you got done or because you, quote, failed at ketosis.
Acknowledges the specificity really makes it land. We've all been there with something.
Totally.
Yeah.
And when you're feeling miserable and judging yourself like that, where does that energy often go? Often, yeah. You take it out on other people. You're snippy, irritable, maybe emotionally guarded, like his first review said.
And when you behave that way,
you feel even more miserable about yourself. It reinforces the self-criticism.
And down you go, spiraling deeper into this negative cycle.
That's the toilet vortex.
Okay, so what's the alternative? The second spiral.
He calls it the cheesy upward spiral.
Approves. A much more appealing destination.
Definitely. And this one starts with that counterintuitive move we just talked about.
Learning to high-five your demons.
Exactly. Treating yourself with that basic level of acceptance and kindness, even when you screw up or see things you don't like.
And as your inner weather gets balmier, as he nicely puts it.
That positive internal shift naturally starts to show up in your external relationships. You become more patient, maybe more present, less reactive.
And critically, he connects this to research on happiness, right?
Yeah, he points out that strong, positive relationships are arguably the biggest predictor of human flourishing and happiness.
So when your relationships improve because you're in a better place internally.
Your inner weather gets even better. You feel more connected, less isolated.
And you spiral upwards. Cheese and all.
Cheese and all. And this is the fundamental connection he's making in the source.
That self-love isn't selfish.
Right. Not in a narcissistic way, but in the sense of, quote, having your own back. It's the opposite of selfish.
Because it actually makes you,
quote, better at loving other people. He points right back to that first brutal 360 review.
all the ways he was caught in that self-critical toilet vortex.
Showed up as difficult behavior in his relationships, being rude, guarded, authoritarian.
And as those relationships suffered, so did he. It reinforces the downward spiral.
Exactly. So he formulates what he tongue-in-cheek calls his amateur unified field theory of love.
Giving it the intentionally kind of ridiculous title, Me, a Love Story.
Agrees, yeah. But he uses love in a really broad sense here.
Not just romantic love.
Now, anything within the human capacity to care. And this capacity, he argues, isn't just some nice-to-have fluffy idea.
It's hardwired.
It's hardwired into us by evolution. Our ability to care for each other, to cooperate, to communicate. That's what allowed our species to survive and thrive.
Okay. And this is where he draws that very large, maybe provocative implication.
Yeah. A failure to exercise this fundamental human capacity to care.
Mm-hmm.
A lack of love, broadly defined,
Mm-hmm.
isn't just a personal failing.
He argues it's at the root of some of our biggest global problems.
Things like inequality, violence, even the climate crisis.
Wow. That's a pretty big leap, connecting personal inner work to global issues like climate change. How does he bridge that gap in the source?
Well, he's careful. He acknowledges these massive problems absolutely require systemic solutions, policy changes, all of that.
Sure.
But at their core, solving them also requires people to care about one another, to care about future generations, people different from themselves.
And it's harder to do that.
It is much harder to do that, he argues, when you're stuck in a ceaseless spiral of self-centered self-flagellation.
When you're trapped in your own internal misery.
Exactly. You just don't have the bandwidth or the emotional resources to genuinely care for others or the planet.
He even jokes there's a geopolitical case for you to get your shit together.
Serms. It's a blunt way to put it, but memorable.
Yeah.
The idea that your internal state isn't just your private business, it actually has ripple effects.
But the really good news, the optimistic part from the source,
is that this capacity for care, this love game, as he calls it, it isn't some fixed factory setting you're either born with or not.
it's a skill.
It's a skill, or more accurately, maybe a family of skills that you can actually train, like training a muscle.
Okay, so how do you train it? He shares specific practices that were key for him, right? After that first wake-up call 360.
Yes. First is starting a regular practice of loving-kindness meditation, the thing he initially resisted.
And he stresses, you don't need to be spiritual or buy into any complex metaphysics.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The instructions he offers for the source are wonderfully simple, really practical.
Okay, walk us through it.
Find a quiet spot, get comfortable sitting, lying down, whatever works. Close your eyes if that feels okay.
Then what?
Start by bringing to mind an easy person. It could be a good friend, a family member, even a pet. Someone who naturally evokes warmth in you.
Got it. An easy target.
Exactly. And then you silently repeat 4 phrases directed towards them. May you be happy, may you be safe, may you be healthy, may you live with ease.
Simple phrases.
Very simple.
Yeah.
And you just kind of feel the intention behind them. Then you gradually expand that circle of care.
So after the easy person,
You apply those same phrases and feelings sequentially to yourself, which can be surprisingly hard for some people.
I bet.
Then to a mentor figure, someone you respect. Then to a neutral person, maybe the barista who served you coffee, the mail carrier,
Yeah.
someone you don't really know.
Okay.
Then, crucially, to a difficult person in your life, someone you have friction with.
That sounds challenging.
It definitely can be. And finally, you extend that wish out to, quote, all beings everywhere.
Wow. That's a wide net.
It is. And he mentions the source, points to actual research showing real benefits from this practice, physiological, psychological, even behavioral changes.
Okay, that's loving kindness meditation. What's the second practice he recommends?
The second one is more like an in-the-moment intervention. He calls it actively counterprogramming against your inner critic.
So this is what you do when you notice yourself starting to slide down that toilet vortex.
Exactly. When you catch that self-critical voice revving up.
What do you do?
Well, he suggests if you're somewhere discreet and nobody's looking, you can literally put a hand on your heart again.
Like he did in the retreat.
Yeah. And then you consciously talk to yourself internally, but you do it the way you would talk to a good friend who is struggling.
With kindness
And
support.
exactly. Cultivating what he calls a supportive inner coach who has high standards but is not a jerk about it.
I like that framing. High standards, but not a jerk.
It's key, right? It's not about letting yourself off the hook for everything, but changing the tone of the inner dialogue from critical to supportive.
And I think a common fear, especially for ambitious people, is that this self-kindness sounds like it might make you soft.
Yeah, that it could erode your edge, as he puts it, that the inner critic is what drives you.
Does he address that?
Does. He counters that fear directly, pointing to research mentioned in the source that suggests the opposite is actually true.
Meaning?
Replacing that sadistic inner tyrant with a supportive inner coach actually makes you more likely to reach your goals.
How so?
Because you're not constantly tripping yourself up with shame, fear of failure, and self-sabotage. You can learn from mistakes without collapsing into self-hatred.
Okay, that makes sense. You're building resilience instead of just beating yourself up.
Precisely.
So after doing all this work, the therapy, the coaching, the retreat, practicing loving kindness, talking to himself like a friend, what was the ultimate payoff described in the source?
Well, he shares that up 3 years after that first brutal 360, he got another one.
Anticipates. Because, as he says, I never learn.
Agrees, exactly. But this one was dramatically different.
How so? What did people say this time?
He says people gushed. They talked about how much he'd changed as a friend, as a mentor, as a colleague.
He gives specific examples from the feedback, doesn't he?
Yeah, like people saying he was now delightful in meetings.
Where previously he'd been described as
a prosecutor.
Wow. Going from prosecutor to delightful in meetings, that is significant change.
Absolutely. And he shares a couple of key quotes from that second review that really stuck with him.
What were they?
One said, his ego is shrinking, which he took as a huge compliment.
Yeah, you can see that. Less self-preoccupation, maybe.
Right. And another simply stated, he's finding his heart.
He's finding his heart. That's quite beautiful, actually.
It really is. Captures the essence of the shift.
And his wife's reaction?
His wife joked, congratulations, now you're boring.
Acknowledges, which, of course, he disagrees with entirely.
Completely. He argues that upping your love game, doing this kind of inner work, is anything but boring.
And he explains why, according to the source.
Yeah, he lays out a few reasons. He says it's countercultural.
How so?
Because it pushes back against that constant societal pressure of never enoughness, the feeling that you always need to be striving, criticizing, improving in a harsh way.
Okay, it goes against the grain.
Right. He also says it's courageous.
Courageous, why?
Because it requires you to actually face those uncomfortable inner demons, the anger, the self-centeredness, instead of just trying to ignore them or beat them down.
Meeting them with warmth takes guts.
It really does.
Maybe.
And finally, he says it's genuinely happiness-producing.
Because
when you learn to high-five your demons, as he puts it, they simply don't have the same power over you. They don't own you as much.
you're less reactive, less trapped in those negative spirals.
Exactly. And ultimately, that inner work makes you, quote, more generous and more available to the world around you.
And he leaves us with one final, very direct, maybe slightly crude analogy from the source.
Oh, yeah. The view is so much better when you pull your head out of your ass.
Affirms. That's certainly a memorable way to wrap it up.
It is. But it drives home the core idea, doesn't it?
It really does. This deep dive, looking through the lens of this one really fascinating source, it highlights that moving away from being your own worst critic,
Towards cultivating just a basic level of self-kindness, having your own back.
it isn't some fluffy indulgence. It's not about being lazy or complacent.
No, it's a fundamental internal shift. and one that directly and profoundly seems to improve your ability to connect with others.
To care for them, to show up for them in a better way.
Which, as the source suggests, could potentially impact things far beyond just your personal life or your immediate relationships.
And the really hopeful message here is that this capacity for care, this skill of love, isn't fixed. It's not something you either have or you don't.
It's trainable, like in either school. The source offers those two concrete practices, loving-kindness meditation,
And consciously counter-programming the inner critic when it pops up.
as tangible ways you can start building that muscle, flexing that capacity for care, starting with yourself.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you, the listener, with. If one person's journey of training their own capacity for kindness can lead to such profound personal change and drastically better relationships, like we saw in the speaker's story,
What could the collective impact potentially be if more people embraced this skill of love? If more of us started, high-fiving our demons instead of fighting them?
consider how even small acts of turning down the volume on your own inner critic, extending just a little warmth inwards, how that might start a ripple effect outwards.
Into your relationships, your community, and maybe even, as the source provocatively suggests, beyond. Something to ponder.